June 6, 1944. While American infantry bled on the shingle at Omaha, the eastern edge of the invasion was unfolding under a different kind of pressure, less famous, less photographed, but just as unforgiving in what it demanded. Sword Beach was not the place where the headlines would be written that morning. It was the place where the plan either held together or came apart later. Out beyond the surf line, the sea was crowded with metal, landing craft stacking in lanes, small silhouettes of control vessels holding station, and farther back, the heavier shapes that mattered most, warships with guns big enough to reach inland, waiting for requests that had to be precise. The light was coming up in slow gray layers. Not daylight, not darkness, just enough to show the coast as a long, low strip of sand broken by smoke flashes and the hard geometry of concrete. From the American perspective, especially the U.S. Marine Corps officers who would later study Normandy as an amphibious case study, Sword wasn't interesting because it was easy. It wasn't. It was interesting because it looked organized under conditions that usually erase organization. Years later, Marines looking at the eastern sector would keep circling the same problem. How do you land under fire, push off the beach, and still keep your sequence intact? Armor, engineers, infantry, radios, naval gunfire, and the clock, without turning into a jam of frightened men and stalled vehicles? Sword Beach gave them an answer they didn't expect. Not in the sense of some miracle or some myth about British calm. Those kinds of stories don't survive a serious staff read. What stood out, what made Marine officers pause, was that the landing at Sword, especially the commando elements moving through that first chaos, read like a chain of decisions made by people who understood what mattered in the first hour. Not romance, not glory, but tempo and linkage. The beach was not the end state. The beach was a temporary problem to be solved fast enough to stop the real disaster from forming inland. That real disaster had a name: calm. And just beyond it, in the German rear areas, the kind of counterattack that could turn a successful landing into a trapped force. On the eastern flank, there was always the same ugly possibility. If you fail to connect your beachhead to your airborne troops, you don't just lose men, you lose time. And time, in an amphibious operation, is the first currency you run out of. So this story doesn't start with the names of units, or a list of commando numbers, or a map full of arrows. It starts with a belief that was shared by anyone who'd ever planned a landing from scratch. That you can do almost anything once you're ashore, but only if you get off the sand before the enemy can turn your shoreline into a killing zone. At Sword, the Germans had already prepared the shoreline to do exactly that. The defenses were not an accident. You see officers trying to keep spacing that the tide wants to erase. You see the immediate instinct, universal in any army, to stop and stare when fire starts coming in. And then you see something else, movement continuing anyway, not as a heroic sprint, but as a controlled flow. This is the exact kind of detail Marines respect, because it matches what they teach. In an amphibious assault, you don't win by being brave for 10 seconds. You win by being functional for an hour. And then there's the other thing, the Commandos. Because Sword wasn't only infantry landing to hold ground. Sword was also a gateway into a linkage mission, one of the most specific and unforgiving tasks in the entire operation. British commandos had to push inland and make contact with the men who had dropped in the night, the airborne troops holding key crossings, including the bridge over the Caen Canal that the world would later romanticize as Pegasus Bridge. If that link-up failed, the airborne could be isolated and destroyed. If it succeeded, the eastern flank became far harder for the Germans to pry open. That mission, linking beach and airborne, was not a nice-to-have. It was structural. It was the kind of operational necessity that doesn't care about pride, or fatigue, or the noise in your ears after landing. And that is where the Marine reaction begins to make sense. Because Marines don't study D-Day to decide who was toughest. They study it to understand what makes amphibious operations collapse. They look for the points where friction becomes fatal. They look for where the beach becomes a bottleneck. They look for where units lose their chain of command, where engineers can't clear lanes, where armor can't move, where naval gunfire becomes disconnected from the people who need it. Sword didn't avoid those dangers by luck. It avoided them, imperfectly, under fire, by keeping the sequence moving. So when you hear the title, What U.S. Marines said, after watching British commandos land at Sword Beach: "Don't imagine some Hollywood scene where Americans are stunned into silence. Imagine something more believable. Imagine a group of Marine officers decades later, in a classroom or a war college setting, watching the same footage again and again, pausing, rewinding, noting the moment where a lane is opened and exploited before it closes, noting how quickly the beach ceases to be the center of gravity, noting how a unit keeps its purpose when the shoreline is trying to strip it away. And then somebody, in that restrained American way, says something that sounds almost too plain to be dramatic, but carries real respect. This held together, under fire, on schedule. Because in amphibious warfare, that is the rarest thing of all. Sword Beach was the easternmost of the 5 Allied landing beaches. On paper, it did not look like the most dramatic assignment of the day. It was roughly 5 miles wide, stretching from Ouistreham westward toward Lyon-sur-Mer, bordered by low dunes, seawalls, and coastal villages that had been quietly converted into fortified positions over the previous years. But geography is deceptive. Sword was not just another strip of sand, it was the hinge of the entire Allied left flank. To its immediate west lay Juno Beach, assigned to Canadian forces. To its east, across the Caen Canal and the Orne River, the terrain narrowed into a corridor. That corridor was the only practical route through which German armored reserves, particularly elements of the 21st Panzer Division, could counterattack toward the sea. If the British failed to secure that flank quickly, the Germans would not need to defeat the entire invasion. They would only need to drive a wedge between beach and airborne, isolate the eastern sector, and compress it against the water. That is why Sword was given a mission that extended far beyond the beach itself. The primary assault force landing at Sword was the 3rd British Infantry Division, under Major General Tom Rennie. Their objectives were sequential and demanding: secure the beach exits, push inland toward Caen, and link up with the 6th Airborne Division, which had dropped during the night to seize key crossings over the Caen Canal and the River Orne. The airborne troops had already fought hard in darkness to capture those bridges. Most famous among them was the crossing later known as Pegasus Bridge, taken in a coup de main glider assault. But holding a bridge and being reinforced at that bridge are two entirely different realities. The airborne were light infantry. They had limited heavy weapons, limited ammunition, and no armor. If German counterattacks came in strength before the seaborne forces reached them, those bridges could become traps rather than triumphs. Sword was the lifeline. Now consider the German side of the equation. The immediate coastal defenses opposite Sword were manned primarily by elements of the 716th Infantry Division, a static formation composed largely of older soldiers and foreign conscripts assigned to hold fixed positions along the Atlantic Wall. It would be a mistake to dismiss them. Static did not mean harmless. They were entrenched in reinforced concrete positions known as Widerstandsnester, resistance nests, each designated by number. These nests were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire across the sand and beach exits. Widerstandsnest 17, for example, near Ouistreham, included concrete casemates housing 75mm guns, machine gun positions, and anti-tank obstacles. Other nests along the sector incorporated Czech hedgehogs, wooden stakes tipped with mines, and anti-boat obstacles placed in belts that would be exposed or submerged, depending on tide. The defensive logic was clear: break the landing craft, slow the infantry, force engineers to clear obstacles under fire, and channel the assault into pre-sighted killing grounds. Behind these static units stood something far more dangerous: the 21st Panzer Division. Stationed inland near Caen, it was the only German armored division in the immediate Normandy area on D-Day morning. While not as elite as the SS Panzer divisions farther south, it possessed tanks, self-propelled guns, and the mobility to exploit a stalled landing. If Sword bogged down, if British forces were pinned at the waterline, 21st Panzer could strike toward the beaches before Allied air superiority fully suppressed German movement. This is the operational tension that U.S. Marine planners later found compelling. Sword was not simply about taking ground, it was about buying time faster than the enemy could organize it. And that makes the linkage with the 6th Airborne Division central to understanding everything that followed. During the early hours of June 6th, airborne troops had secured the eastern bridges and blown other crossings to delay German armor moving from the east. But they were thinly spread. They faced counterattacks from German units including elements of the 736th Grenadier Regiment and armored reconnaissance units probing their positions. The Commandos landing at Sword were not just decorative additions to the assault. They were assigned a specific timed movement inland to reach those airborne troops. That meant moving beyond the immediate chaos of the beach and pushing through terrain that had not yet been fully secured. In amphibious doctrine, American or British, the first principle is always consolidation of the beachhead. Secure the sand, clear exits, establish control. Only then expand Sword required something slightly different. It required expansion while consolidation was still incomplete. That subtlety matters. When U.S. Marines later examined Sword Beach as part of amphibious case studies, they were not interested in national pride. They were interested in the structural problem. How do you maintain forward momentum when your flanks are not yet guaranteed? How do you push inland when the beach is still under intermittent artillery fire? How do you prevent your assault from becoming static long enough for armored counterattack to form? At Sword, the margin for delay was thin. The naval bombardment preceding the landings had targeted coastal batteries and known defensive positions, but no bombardment erases all resistance. Smoke, dust, and debris obscured some German positions rather than destroying them outright. As landing craft approached, machine gun fire and artillery from inland positions still reached the sand. And yet, the beach did not become a second Omaha. Part of that was geography. Sword's defenses, though formidable, were not arranged on bluffs like Omaha's cliffs. The terrain allowed more rapid dispersal once gaps were opened. Part of it was the effectiveness of pre-landing bombardment, and part of it was simple timing. The tide, the sequencing of waves, and the ability of engineers to clear lanes before congestion became catastrophic. But the real importance of Sword becomes visible only when you step back from the sand and look at the map. If Sword fails, Juneau's eastern flank is exposed. If Sword stalls, the 6th Airborne risks isolation. If Sword collapses, the Germans can counterattack along the narrow corridor between the Orne and the sea, potentially driving to the water and cutting the beachhead in two. It is not an exaggeration to say that Sword was a structural anchor point for the entire eastern sector. This is why American Marines studying D-Day did not treat Sword as secondary. They understood something that casual observers often miss. In amphibious operations, the decisive action is sometimes not where the heaviest casualties occur. It is where the system either locks together or fails to. Sword had to lock together. Infantry landing waves, engineers clearing obstacles, armor coming ashore, naval gunfire shifting inland, commandos moving through the beachhead without being trapped by it, airborne forces holding their bridges long enough to be reinforced. All of this had to happen inside a window measured not in days, but in hours. And that is what made the next development, the sand, the smoke, the friction, so consequential. If Sword mattered because of what it had to connect, then the conditions under which it unfolded would determine whether that connection could ever be made. Sword Beach was the easternmost of the 5 Allied landing beaches. On paper, it did not look like the most dramatic assignment of the day. It was roughly 5 miles wide, stretching from Ouistreham westward toward Lyon-sur-Mer, bordered by low dunes, seawalls, and coastal villages that had been quietly converted into fortified positions over the previous years. But geography is deceptive. Sword was not just another strip of sand. It was the hinge of the entire Allied left flank. To its immediate west lay Juneau Beach, assigned to Canadian forces. To its east, across the Caen Canal and the Orne River, the terrain narrowed into a corridor. That corridor was the only practical route through which German armored reserves, particularly elements of the 21st Panzer Division, could counterattack toward the sea. If the British failed to secure that flank quickly, the Germans would not need to defeat the entire invasion. That is why Sword was given a mission that extended far beyond the beach itself. The primary assault force landing at Sword was the 3rd British Infantry Division under Major General Tom Rennie. Their objectives were sequential and demanding: secure the beach exits, push inland toward Caen, and link up with the 6th Airborne Division, which had dropped during the night to seize key crossings over the Caen Canal and the River Orne. The airborne troops had already fought hard in darkness to capture those bridges. Most famous among them was the crossing later known as Pegasus Bridge, taken in a coup de main glider assault. But holding a bridge and being reinforced at that bridge are two entirely different realities. The airborne were light infantry. They had limited heavy weapons, limited ammunition, and no armor.